Have you ever noticed how some people never truly leave your mind, even when they are no longer part of your life? Time passes, routines change, new distractions come in, yet their presence still appears in your thoughts without warning. It can happen in the middle of a normal day, during a quiet moment, or even when you are trying to focus on something completely unrelated. And in that instant, it feels like nothing has changed internally, even though everything has changed externally. This is not just memory, it is emotional imprinting. When someone creates a strong emotional impact, the mind does not store them like ordinary information. It stores them like unresolved experience. That is why they return in thoughts again and again, especially when there was no clear emotional closure or understanding of how things ended. Your mind is not trying to hurt you. It is trying to complete a pattern that feels unfinished. It replays moments, conversations, and feelings, not because you want it to, but because something inside still associates meaning with that connection. And until that meaning is fully processed, the thought does not disappear. It simply returns, quietly, in cycles, whenever your mind is at rest. Sometimes what keeps a person in your mind is not love, and not even memory in the traditional sense. It is something far more subtle: emotional ambiguity. When a connection ends without clarity, without a direct emotional conclusion, the mind does not register it as complete. It treats it like an unfinished experience, something that still requires resolution. This is where the hidden pull begins. The lack of clear answers creates a psychological gap, and the human mind naturally tries to fill gaps. It starts replaying moments, reinterpreting words, and searching for meaning in things that were never fully explained, not because the connection was necessarily stronger, but because it was incomplete. Clear endings, even painful ones, allow the mind to close a chapter. There is structure in closure, even if it hurts. But ambiguity does the opposite. It keeps the emotional system slightly activated, as if the story is still ongoing somewhere in the background. That is why you can move forward in life, yet still feel mentally tied to someone who is no longer present. The pull is not always emotional desire. Often, it is cognitive tension. The mind wants resolution. It wants to understand what really happened, what was meant, and what was not said. And until that understanding is reached, the connection continues to surface in thoughts, not as a choice, but as a loop. This is why some endings feel heavier than others, not because of intensity, but because of incompleteness. And the more incomplete the emotional experience feels, the more the mind holds on to it, trying to make sense of something that was never fully defined. What most people misunderstand about emotionally avoidant individuals is the assumption that distance means absence of feeling. On the surface, they appear detached, unaffected, and quickly moved on. But what is visible externally is not always aligned with what is happening internally. Avoidant patterns are not built on a lack of emotion. They are built on a discomfort with emotional intensity. When feelings become too strong or too close, the natural response is not expression, but withdrawal. So instead of processing emotions in real time, they step back from them. They create space, not because nothing is there, but because everything feels like too much at once. However, emotional withdrawal does not erase emotional experience. It fragments it. Small pieces of memory, brief emotional impressions, and unprocessed moments remain in the background of the mind. These fragments do not always appear in a continuous flow. Instead, they surface randomly, during silence, during routine moments, or when external distractions fade. This is why their detachment can be misleading. While they may seem fully moved on, internally there can still be scattered traces of emotional processing happening over time. Not in an overwhelming way, but in subtle interruptions that come and go. The key misunderstanding is assuming that avoidance equals emotional emptiness. In reality, it often means delayed emotional engagement. They do not always experience feelings in the moment they arise. Instead, those feelings are postponed, stored, and sometimes only partially understood later. So what looks like indifference is often a different rhythm of emotional processing. Not absence, but fragmentation. Not denial, but distance from intensity. And that difference is what most people fail to recognize. What you see on the surface is usually calmness, a composed presence, a sense of control, and a way of moving through life as if nothing is unsettled. But beneath that exterior, there is often a very different internal reality that never gets expressed. For emotionally avoidant individuals, feelings are not always processed in real time. Instead of sitting with emotional intensity, there is a tendency to suppress it or postpone it. In the moment, this creates relief. The situation feels controlled, contained, and manageable. But what is not processed does not disappear. It gets stored. This is where the silent internal conflict begins. Suppressed emotions do not stay silent forever. They resurface later, often in unpredictable ways. It might be a quiet evening, a random trigger, or a moment when external distractions are no longer strong enough to keep the mind occupied. In those gaps, emotional fragments begin to surface again. These resurfacing moments are not always intense or clear. Sometimes they are just feelings without context. A sense of discomfort, a memory without detail, or a sudden emotional shift that cannot be easily explained. And because they are not fully understood, they are often pushed away again. This creates an ongoing cycle: suppression in the moment, delayed processing later, and brief emotional resurfacing in between. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. But internally, there is a quiet inconsistency that never fully settles. The conflict is not loud. It does not always show itself in obvious ways. But it exists in the background, shaping reactions, influencing distance, and affecting emotional availability without being fully acknowledged. Distance is often misunderstood as emotional absence, especially when someone appears calm, detached, or unaffected after stepping away. But in reality, distance does not automatically erase emotional connection. In many cases, it simply changes how that connection is processed. For individuals with avoidant tendencies, emotional intensity can feel overwhelming. So instead of staying close to it, they create space. This distance is not always a sign that feelings are gone. It is often a way to reduce internal pressure and regain a sense of control. On the surface, it looks like moving on. Internally, it is more about managing emotional discomfort. What happens next is not emotional disappearance, but emotional cycling. The mind shifts into distraction, work, routines, conversations, and anything that keeps attention externally focused. This creates the impression of stability. But emotions that are not fully processed do not dissolve. They remain in the background, waiting for quieter moments. And in those quieter moments, something different happens. Memories, impressions, and emotional traces begin to resurface. Not in a constant or overwhelming way, but in brief and unexpected flashes. A reminder, a feeling, or a thought that appears without warning. These moments do not always lead to action, but they reveal that the emotional imprint still exists. This cycle of distraction and resurfacing creates inconsistency. It is not emotional erasure, but emotional fragmentation. The connection is not fully lived in the present, but it is also not fully gone. So distance should not always be interpreted as the end of feeling. In many cases, it reflects a different way of managing emotion, one that avoids depth in the moment, but still carries fragments of it forward in time. What keeps you mentally attached is not always the person, but the loop your mind creates around them. Even when the connection has ended externally, internally it can continue to feel active, as if something is still unfinished. This happens when emotional closure is missing. Closure is not just about endings, it is about understanding. When something ends without clarity, explanation, or emotional resolution, the mind does not register it as fully complete. Instead, it keeps the experience open in the background, waiting for resolution that never arrives. So your thoughts return. Not randomly, but as part of a psychological pattern. You replay conversations, revisit moments, and search for meaning in things that were never fully explained. Each time you do this, your mind is not trying to hurt you, it is trying to organize something that feels incomplete. This creates a mental loop. The connection is no longer active in reality, but it remains active in cognition. You are not interacting with the person anymore, but you are still interacting with the idea of them, the memory of them, and the emotional weight they left behind. What makes this loop stronger is uncertainty. Clear endings allow the mind to release, but unclear endings keep the mind engaged. It continues to question, analyze, and revisit, hoping to find a conclusion that feels satisfying enough to stop the cycle. Over time, this loop becomes familiar. Even when it causes discomfort, it becomes a repeated pattern of thinking. And that repetition strengthens attachment, not because the bond is still growing, but because the mind has not been given a reason to fully close it. Until that closure happens internally, the loop continues, quietly, persistently, in the background of your thoughts. The real shift does not happen when the other person changes, and it does not happen when they finally give answers or clarity. It begins at the moment your understanding becomes stronger than your confusion. For a long time, the psychological hold exists because your mind is trying to solve something that feels incomplete. You overthink, you analyze, and you revisit memories, hoping to find meaning that was never clearly given. This keeps the connection mentally active, even when it is no longer present in reality. But then, something changes internally. You start to see the pattern instead of just the pain. You recognize that your mind has been looping, not because there is something new to discover, but because it is stuck in unresolved emotional processing. That awareness is the first break in the cycle. Understanding replaces uncertainty, and when uncertainty reduces, the emotional grip begins to weaken. You stop searching for hidden meanings in every memory. You stop waiting for explanations that may never come. Instead of asking why it happened repeatedly, you start accepting that not everything will be fully explained. This is where emotional detachment begins, not as suppression, but as clarity. You are no longer feeding the loop with constant analysis. You are observing it from a distance rather than being inside it. And that shift changes everything. Because attachment is often maintained by mental engagement. When engagement decreases, so does the intensity of the bond.